right, now that the recording's in process, welcome everyone. My name is Michaela Lee. I'm from BSR. I'm joined by my colleague Dunstan Allison Hope from BSR and Yvonne Lucas from Business Call to Action. This is the 6th webinar in our 7-webinar series, a partnership between BSR and Business Call to Action. And this particular session is on data protection and privacy. You can take a look at Business Call to Action's website for some of our previous webinars, including a 101 course on business human rights and 4 industry deep dives in consumer goods, food, beverage, and agriculture, financial services, and infrastructure, energy, and utilities. Our 7th webinar will be tomorrow at the same time, and it will be looking at the Business and Human Rights Toolkit that is available on the Business Call to Action website. So feel free to join us for that. This is an open session, so feel free to take yourself off of mute and jump in with any questions you may have. You can also raise your hand or use the chat function, which is in the bottom right corner of the page. We are also recording so that you can go back and take a look at some of this content, or feel free to share it with others. And they will all the recordings will be posted on the Business Call to Action website. So we are going to cover a couple of different things today. We'll first do a bit of an introduction to who is speaking on the line, and then go into a brief overview of business and human rights. If you want a little bit more of a deeper dive, you can take a look at our 101 training that's recorded on the Business Call to Action's website. And then we'll dive straight into content about what data protection and privacy are, why you as a business should respect the right to privacy, and what businesses can do to address data protection and privacy risks. A little bit about myself. My name is Michaela Lee. I'm a manager in human rights at BSR and have been with BSR in our San Francisco office for about 3 years. I work with large multinational companies on how to understand human rights, the human rights impacts of their business, and how to build management systems that address those human rights issues. My colleague Dunstan Allison Hope is also on the line and will take us through some of the data protection and privacy content. Dunstan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Michaela. So this is Dunstan Allison Hope. I'm based in San Francisco, and among other things, I've worked with a lot of our member companies on issues of privacy and freedom of expression. So my day job often involves with working with the likes of Google or Microsoft or Facebook on some of the issues we're going to cover today. So looking forward to this discussion and questions you may have.
Great. Thanks so much, Dunstan. And about BSR, we are a global nonprofit business network with offices in San Francisco, where Dunstan and I are based, as well as New York, Europe, and across Asia. As an organization, we work on a range of corporate responsibility and sustainability issues, including climate, women's empowerment, human rights, and a number of others. And feel free to take a look at our website, bsr.org, to learn a little bit more about us. I'd also like to allow Yvonne to jump in and introduce Business Call to Action.
Thank you, Michaela. This is Ivan Lukáš. I work as an outreach and membership lead at Business Call to Action, which is a membership-based platform for inclusive businesses, established in 2008 and hosted by United Nations Development Programme and supported by 4 donor agencies. As of now, we have 223 member companies operating in more than 67 countries globally across multiple sectors such as food and agriculture, consumer products, healthcare, financial services, or energy and infrastructure, and information technology services, information technology sector. And our members come in all sizes. It could be multinational companies, national companies, but majority of them, 60%, are small and medium enterprises. And what all these companies share in common is that they pursue inclusive business model And jointly, our members pledged to provide access to financial services to nearly 60 million people. They pledged to improve access to healthcare, enhance access to energy, or provide for decent work and livelihoods, to mention but few of those commitments. And maybe a few words on inclusive business concepts before you continue with human rights content. Inclusive business is defined as a commercially viable business model that engages low-income people in its business operations. And it engages them as employees, as suppliers, distributors, or consumers of products and services of inclusive businesses. So both aspects are very important. It has to be commercial, profitable enterprise, which is having positive social or environmental impact. And it is also for these reasons that the webinar series, the masterclasses, are relevant for inclusive businesses, the masterclasses on human rights, because inclusive businesses typically would operate in relatively more difficult environments when human rights may be an issue. But at the same time, human rights, as has been shown throughout the course, also represent business opportunity for some of those inclusive businesses, because many of these human rights are directly linked to some of sustainable development goals, to which eventually inclusive businesses contribute. So thank you, Michaela.
Great, thanks, Ivan. So I will be taking us through the next couple of slides on business and human rights, a bit of an overview. And then I'll pass it off to Dunstan, who will take us through more of the data protection and privacy content. Again, some of this content has been covered on our 101 human rights training, so feel free to take a look at that if you want a bit more of a deeper dive into what business and human rights means. So what are human rights? What are we talking about when we talk about human rights in business? There are definitely some human rights issues that are quite obvious. Child labor and forced labor are, for the most part, explicitly known to be a violation of human rights, and businesses connected with those issues typically want to address them in order to avoid reputational impacts, legal impacts, and others. But some are less obvious, and privacy is one of those. In terms of how we define human rights and understand what that means, we typically can think about it as a basic code of conduct for human beings, or baseline expectations for how we treat one another. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was developed in 1948, lays out a number of fundamental intrinsic rights that has been signed on to by almost every country in the world. This year is the 70th anniversary for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's been around for a number of decades and has been codified in a variety of different documents and treaties that lay out more detail about what each of those rights mean. There is one of these documents is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This was developed in 2011 and is a blueprint for companies on how they can respect human rights. This was novel in the sense that before the UN Guiding Principles existed, human rights were mostly tied to countries and countries' responsibility to protect human rights of their citizens. But the development of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights established businesses, the expectation for businesses to respect human rights, and provided guidance on how they can do so. Some of that guidance included providing, developing due diligence approaches, mitigating human rights impacts, and then also addressing that third pillar of remedy and providing access to remedy. So we'll talk about a couple of those elements as we get into data protection and privacy. But this is the foundation and the core for how we think of business and human rights. And defines much of our thinking about the way that businesses approach these issues. At this point, I will pass it over to Dunstan to take us through content on data protection and privacy and what that means for businesses today. Go ahead, Dunstan.
Thank you, Michaela. And I'm going to present, but also pause through the presentation to take any questions you may have. So the first section of this presentation is addressing the question, what are data protection and privacy? So this is a background to the topic that we're actually talking about today. Now I need to figure out how to get the slide to advance. There must be some button I can press to make that happen. Hold on. There we go. I found it. So what are data protection and privacy? So privacy is a fundamental right protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it is protected under Article 12, which we have listed here. I've been working on privacy for many years, and I find it very helpful to go back to this article quite often to remind myself precisely how it is written. And it's written as follows: no one shall be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor or reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against interference or attacks. So that's a description of what is meant by privacy, and it covers a couple of different things. The scope of privacy typically includes the protection and confidentiality of personal information and data, the ability to access information and data that has been retained about you, and the ability to have incorrect information held on you corrected or deleted. This presentation also covers the concept of data protection. Data protection is the process of safeguarding important information from corruption, compromise, or loss, and it has long been recognized as a fundamental aspect to the right to privacy. So the right to privacy is respected in part by things that you do as a company in terms of how you use and share data, but it's also about protecting that data from harm or from corruption or from compromise from the actions of others. So how can business affect the right to privacy? There are two different categories that I want to describe here. The first is around direct impacts that business can have on privacy, and I've listed them here. It's through the collection and storage and use of personal information or data. It's about whether you can anonymize personal data. It relates to any breaches or hacks of that data or information. It's about when you choose to share communications and information with others. And it's also about the personal tracking and surveillance of individuals. There's a range of activities that you might do as a business that would directly impact privacy and where you can make decisions about what you do in ways that affect the human right to privacy. But in this field, there are a range of indirect impacts as well. And these are things where you don't necessarily control your impact on privacy, but you are connected to them. So companies can be requested by local or government officials to disclose information that they have about a customer. So they may receive law enforcement requests for data and information and be under a legal requirement to share that data with the law enforcement official. It's also worth noting that the right to privacy enables individuals, rights holders, to exercise other rights. If you have your right to privacy protected, you're more likely to be able to exercise other human rights like the right to freedom of expression, the right to security, the right to assembly. And so a violation of the right to privacy can lead to the violation of other human rights as well. So there are direct human rights impacts that result from things that you do, but then there are also indirect human rights impacts that result from the actions of others or what others request of you. So let me pause there and just see if there are any questions before I move on to this question of why companies should respect the right to privacy. I will move on. So this segment of the presentation covers why a company should respect the right to privacy. And there are three different items I want to go through. The first covers user trust and confidence. This is related to the fact that customers are increasingly concerned about the privacy of their data. That if a data breach is known, a customer may decide to stop using a product or switch to an alternative service provider. So there are lots of business reasons to protect privacy in relation to user trust and the confidence the user would have in your business. There are also other costs related to data breaches. So think about not just the loss to business that I just described, but the impact on reputation of your company and the time spent on recovering from a data breach or a privacy violation. The employee time that is spent remedying and rectifying that situation can be quite large. And we've given one case study here which puts a dollar number on the cost of data breaches. The second reason relates to opportunities for investment and growth. So if the previous reason was about managing risk, this reason is about maximizing opportunities that may exist for you. Investors will want to invest in companies that are trustworthy, that are compliant with the way in which business should be done today. And a good record on data protection and privacy will help show that you are a responsible business. What we are seeing in our work is that investors are increasingly recognizing the role of privacy as part of the broader social and environmental impact of a business, and are increasingly asking companies to explain their approach to privacy as part of their broader approach to social and environmental issues. We've included one example here, which is the CEO of BlackRock, but there are other similar examples. A letter that he sent to the companies that BlackRock invest in, emphasizing the importance of understanding the social impact of your business and protecting the prosperity and security of citizens that are in your value chain, either as investors or employees or customers. The third reason is around legal compliance. More and more governments around the world are establishing data protection and privacy laws, and not taking action and not having a proactive approach to data protection and privacy could see companies exposed to different lawsuits or legal risks. The most high-profile recent regulatory development relates to the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which came into effect in May 2018. That regulation provides enhanced personal privacy rights for EU citizens. It increases the duty on business to protect human rights. It makes the reporting of data breaches mandatory, and it provides for quite significant penalties for non-compliance. So a lot of companies in Europe who are providing service to EU citizens have invested a lot of time and effort in compliance with the GDPR over recent years. But what we're seeing is other jurisdictions also putting in rules and regulations to address privacy. And we've listed recent new laws here, as well as proposed legislation that exists in a variety of different countries. I would also say that the existence of the GDPR has changed the attitude of a lot of technology companies towards privacy law and regulation. Just here in the United States, over the past couple of months, a lot of the major internet companies have changed their public position on privacy and are now in favor of increased rules and regulations on privacy at a federal level. So we're expecting to see more laws, rules, and regulations applying to privacy. So just to conclude this section, we've written out a few risks that do exist for inclusive businesses. One piece we'd like to emphasize in particular on this call is that small and medium-sized enterprises can be, especially vulnerable to digital security and privacy risks, especially given the fact that you don't necessarily have all of the resources at your disposal that larger companies have on a topic that's quite complex. And it's also worth noting that the growth of mobile devices has increased the scope and nature of risk when it comes to privacy. We used to think of mobile devices as much more secure than they are today, and mobile devices themselves are much more frequently under attack compared to perhaps what they were a few years ago. We're also seeing suppliers to companies targeted as part of nefarious efforts to hack into companies and secure data or insert backdoors into communications that wouldn't otherwise exist. So we are seeing a lot of companies take increasingly proactive approaches to privacy and security in their supply chains, as well as within their own companies. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions before I cover what you can do to address data protection and privacy.
Hello?
Hi. Yes.
Hi. I'm just raising my hand. I didn't know if you see it. On that point about small and medium enterprises, one of the things that it seems to be happening more recently is that this is being outsourced. So a small or medium company says, well, I use, X, Y, or Z, big data vendor, or maybe it's for order taking or other types of things. And they say, well, I just rely on that larger provider to safeguard my customer information. There is I think, a tendency to outsource. Is this a place where outsourcing might have a positive impact, or have you been sort of looking at that? Obviously, the outsourcing typically goes to an IT firm that's much larger than the small or medium enterprise looking for help.
Yeah, it's a good question. It certainly changes the risk profile. So there is a lot of outsourcing, and you can outsource data processing and data storage to organizations, companies that, because they are larger, have much greater sophistication on data protection and privacy issues. So what we are seeing is a lot of companies insert into contracts, various requirements to make sure that companies are compliant with GDPR. But it doesn't totally outsource your risk. So just to give one example, I mentioned indirect risk earlier on, and the receiving requests from law enforcement agencies for data. If you have data stored through a cloud services provider, so one of the major cloud companies, if they receive a request from law enforcement agencies to access your data, they're going to pass that request right back to you. So even though your data may be stored with a large service provider, that service provider may come back to you when it comes to certain elements of privacy risk. So when it comes to risks that we talked about in terms of hacking and nefarious activities to try and get data, yes, outsourcing can significantly reduce your risk. But it doesn't completely eliminate it, especially on other aspects of risk, like when law enforcement agencies want to secure or want to receive data or personal information from you. Are there other questions? I'm just thinking through further answer that question too. I think one of the interesting developments will be as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated and companies seek to use data from a wide variety of sources and combine different types of data to reach conclusions, create algorithms, improve the sophistication of artificial intelligence, being sure that your data is not being used in ways that you wouldn't want it to as part of an outsourced activity would be an important thing to check. So I'm going to move on to what companies should do to address data protection and privacy. And there are three main sections to cover. We've called them Discover, which is about identifying what personal data you have and where it resides. The second segment we've called Manage, which covers how you govern personal data, how it's used, and how it's accessed. And then the third segment we've called Protect, which is establishing security controls to prevent, detect, and respond to vulnerabilities and data breaches. In terms of Discover, it sounds basic, but it's very important to identify what personal data you have and where it resides. We've listed here various types of data and ways in which data can be stored and collected that might represent useful checklists for you. But we've also put at the bottom of this slide a source as to where this came from. And it came from an organization called Global Partners Digital. And if you are interested in reading further on this particular topic, they undertake activities on privacy with a specific focus on small and medium-sized enterprises. And so they are a good resource for you. You'll notice them come up in a couple of other places in this presentation as well. One additional thing to note on this slide is that personal data can take a variety of different forms. There's fairly basic personal data that you see listed on the left here, but then there's personal data that may be more sensitive for a variety of reasons, and we've listed those reasons to the right. So you'll notice it's important to sort of think about the sense that different types of data present different levels of risk and different levels of sensitivity. And some data that you might share more liberally will be different than some data you might want to have greater efforts in place to protect. We've listed on this slide from a similar source some key questions you might want to ask about how your data is currently used and accessed. There are questions like, what steps are being taken to ensure the security of the information or data that you collect? Are there systems in place to limit and monitor the access your employees have to that information and data? Do you have the right controls in place to make sure that only those employees that really need to see and use personal data have those access rights? Are users informed about the information that is collected? And what steps are in place to make sure that users have consented to how their data is collected and how it is used? What are the channels for users to find out what information or data has been collected about them? One particularly important element is to understand how you as a company may be disclosing or selling data or information to other parties, to third parties. What information are you sharing with other organizations? Are users aware of the fact that their data may be shared with other organizations, and for what purpose? And then finally, something I've mentioned earlier on as well, does your business receive requests for information or data from the government, the police, security services, or other public bodies and law enforcement agencies? Certain companies in certain sectors are more likely to receive requests from law enforcement agencies than others. If you are on the receiving end of requests, what policies and processes do you have in place to know whether those requests should be granted, whether those requests are legitimate, whether they're following the right processes and procedures that governments have in place governing how they request data from companies. I'm trying to advance the slide. Here we go. Also, in terms of managing data, there are a number of different principles that it can be useful to think about and follow in how you manage the data that you hold. And these principles have been taken from another organization I'd like to highlight, Privacy International. They're a UK-based NGO that's very active on the right to privacy, and we often benefit from using their material. So I'd recommend them as a good source for you if you are looking to explore these issues in more depth. But we've listed here key principles that they've set out in terms of how personal data can be used and accessed. Things like, is your processing of data fair? Is it lawful and transparent? Are you being clear about the purpose for which you are processing data? Personal data should be processed for specified, explicit, legitimate purposes that are stated at the moment in time that you collect that data, and any further processing of that data would need to be compatible with that purpose. And I certainly find that notion of being clear about the purpose for which you are collecting and processing data is very helpful to keep in mind throughout everything you do on the topic of privacy. Another principle here is minimization, the principle that you should process data to the extent to which it is adequate and relevant for the purpose that you are trying to undertake, and you only should really collect and process the data that's required for that process, for that purpose, and not go above and beyond. So there are a few other principles that you can see here as well, and it's worth thinking through these principles in the particular context in which you are operating. When it comes to protect, it is important to establish security protocols to prevent, detect, and respond to vulnerabilities and data breaches. And we've listed some key component parts here. Publicly expressing your business commitment to respecting privacy and protecting customer data. Ensuring that you have a privacy policy with clear definitions on the data you collect, how it's collected and used, and how it may be accessed by a customer. Assessing your privacy and data protection risks and developing an action plan to address and mitigate those risks. And undertaking impact assessments for any new products and services to ensure that the risks to privacy and data protection are accounted for. And I'll just mention at this point, I referenced earlier on the GDPR. One of the requirements of the GDPR is to undertake a data protection impact assessment when you are introducing a significant new product or service or processing significant amounts of data that might present a risk. And the GDPR says that that data protection impact assessment needs to cover not just privacy, but all potential impacts on the rights and freedoms of data subjects. So those impact assessments that we're listing here are becoming an increasingly important part of a company's approach to privacy, especially if you are processing significant amounts of data. Providing access to remedy to any victims of a data breach or a privacy violation. And the final bullet point here covers the topic I mentioned earlier on as well. When you receive requests from governments or law enforcement agencies, scrutinizing those requests and determining whether they are in accordance with the laws that apply to you as a company. Has the right process been followed? Is the request for data consistent with the laws that apply in the jurisdiction in which you are operating? Should you perhaps push back on the government or the law enforcement agency making that request if you think it is overbroad or asking for too much data from about your users. I want to take a moment to emphasize a particular element of privacy that I imagine is going to become even more important in the future than it is today, given the amount of time children increasingly spend online and the way in which children increasingly live out their lives in a virtual world as well as the real world around us. Children are vulnerable to intrusions into their privacy and deserve additional protections to ensure that their privacy rights aren't violated. We've listed on the left here considerations as it relates to children's privacy, and then some perspectives on what business can do to protect children's rights as it relates to privacy. So the first consideration is around consent, and it's important for children to provide meaningful consent to how any data that they're sharing is used. But of course, children might have lower levels of understanding about the consent that they are giving. So the means of consent should be consistent. It should match the level of understanding that children might have about the consent that they are providing. And of course, children develop at different speeds and have different levels of understanding at different ages. And so it's important to think through what consent might be required for different types of processing of children's data. And that actually relates directly to the second bullet point here, that children, the capacity of children to understand how their data is being used evolves over time, and different children evolve in different speeds, and so it's important to keep that front of mind as a consideration. And children may need different channels, different ways to access remedy if there is a violation, if there is an abuse of their data. So what can business do? We've listed some key items on the right. Require free and informed consent of the child or their parent and guardian before collecting and processing personal data. And of course, one also needs to take into consideration here the level of understanding the parent or the guardian may have about how children use online services and their own understanding of what consent they are providing. Making terms and conditions clear, concise and accessible, and adapted to the level of understanding of the child or the parent or the guardian. Offering a range of different privacy settings with different features that both parents and children can access. And keeping the collection of children's data as minimal as possible. So some of the principles that we talked about earlier on in terms of minimizing the amount of data you're collecting, keeping it consistent with the purpose of the service you're providing, that becomes super important in the context of children and how children lead their lives online. And then finally, helping to educate and inform children about how to protect their personal data and helping increase the literacy children may have about their privacy rights and how they should be thinking about the services that they use. Some of that might happen in the context of the service itself, but we're also seeing companies play roles in helping educators in the school system think through how to educate children most effectively on this topic, given how complex it is. So we do want to emphasize how significant children's rights are in the context of the human right to privacy. We also want to emphasize that children's rights are especially important in industries outside of the technology industry. So if you think of the retail industry, for example, digital advertising, there are many, many different sectors that interact with children online. So the considerations here cover more than just technology companies themselves. So let me pause there and see if there are questions, especially since we've covered quite a large amount of content. So let me see if there are any questions before I move on. Okay, so the next slide, excuse me, provides one case study for you, which is a company called TAP, which strives to bring financial inclusion and economic empowerment to the unbanked by, excuse me, by connecting social, mobile, and physical spheres across different communities. One of their services is to collect information and data from customers. So they have a privacy policy that lays out how they collect, use, disclose, transfer, and retain information. That policy covers how they collect information and personal data, disclosure of how they share that information with third parties. It covers the issue of location data and the right users have to access their data or correct it if they believe that some of that data is wrong. And you can see that example on the right. I have one more slide to share before we have more opportunity for questions. It's quite a long list of different resources that exist for you on privacy. Earlier on in the presentation, I highlighted two organizations, Privacy International and Global Partners Digital, but there are a range of other resources for you here. I think another resource, or not another, one of the resources listed here that I've certainly made use of in the past that's quite user-friendly are the resources provided by the UK International Commissioner's Office around preparing for and becoming compliant with the General Data Protection Regulation. I've used those resources in the past and have found them tremendously helpful, very user-friendly, very clear, very easy to understand. So as you think about how to address privacy and think about how it applies to your specific business context and the way in which you as a company use data, a number of these resources might be useful for you. On children and children's rights, UNICEF have published quite a lot of information over the past 2 or 3 years that I've also found extremely valuable. We've got a couple of links here to resources that UNICEF have provided. Let me pause there and see if you have any further questions.
Hi, may I jump in, Dunstan?
Yes.
One of the things I find most interesting about this entire topic is that consumers themselves, their own notions of what privacy is and or how to protect it keep evolving sort of in hindsight and in reaction to crises that have been, cropping up. And I find that that's maybe one thing that's distinctive about this compared to other human rights that have been, accepted and have been understood for a longer period of time. So I'm really interested, you had a special call out for the children's rights of privacy as well. I think that's another area that has not yet maybe been explored or maybe will evolve a lot more, in the future, potentially involving other legislation, although I don't know if there's anything, on the horizon. But it's just the whole area of practice is very intriguing because so many things are being learned through mistakes, over time. And so consumers' ideas about this, I think, shift from year to year, which makes it a very challenging landscape, I think, to operate.
I completely agree. And what's interesting is they shift in different directions too. So on the one hand, you might say that there are users who are more relaxed about how their data is used. They're more comfortable living in a world where their data is shared and processed for all sorts of legitimate and good business reasons in ways that perhaps a decade ago we would have been more concerned about. On the other hand, and this speaks to some of the business case for addressing privacy that we covered earlier on, as users become more aware of their privacy rights, they might be more assertive in how should I say, in advocating for them, and more selective in terms of what data they share or which companies they're willing to do business with. I think the second thing I would emphasize that's really struck me working on this topic, especially from a human rights perspective, is that some users are more vulnerable than other users. We've talked about children, but you can also think about advocates, human rights defenders, politicians, people who are active in policy debates in countries where perhaps human rights standards aren't as high as others. And so some users face greater risks than others, and understanding the differential risk of different users is important. And understanding whether the user, those particular users, the higher risk users, are empowered to make decisions about how their data is used and have the ability to participate in decisions about how their data is used is becoming quite important. So these ideas of empowerment, how empowered is the user, and participation, is the user able to participate in decisions about how their data is used, I think is also going to become very important, and speaks to the point you made about user awareness of privacy evolving over time.
But just one final comment, though. I don't want to take up too much time, but there's that organization called Access Now, which I find useful for tracking data. For tracking globally what countries are making what kinds of moves around data legislation. So that's another interesting resource to, get on their mailing list and just kind of see what's happening as the climate and the legislation keeps changing.
Yes, I second that. Access Now is a great resource, and actually to your point earlier on about how this issue is evolving, it's fascinating that back in, I think, 2011 or so when they were established, they were sort of one employee in a very small conference. Now they're a very large organization with tens of employees and a very, very large annual conference that attracts about 2,500 people. And the growth of that organization kind of illustrates the growth of concern about these issues and the importance of them to business. So definitely another good resource. Michaela, I don't know if you have any questions on this topic, especially given the previous trainings that we've run, if there's anything that came up in the previous trainings that could or should be asked in this session.
Yeah, thanks, Dunstan. Just one question here. Much of the content has been about customer or user privacy. And I'm wondering what you might be able to share about protecting the privacy of employees and workers as well, because that can often be a risk for companies too.
I think you've answered your own question. It is also a risk. So the advice we gave in the third section, I'm just looking for it on the slides here, around identifying what personal data you have and where it resides, how you're governing data, establishing security controls to prevent and detect vulnerabilities. All of that applies to employee data as well. And for some companies, employee data might be the most sensitive data that they hold. So if you're in a line of business where you're not actually interacting with a large amount of user or consumer data, it may be that your employee data is the most sensitive data that you have.
Great, thank you.
And with that, I guess we should close the training. I hope this has been helpful for you. I would really emphasize the list of additional resources. I have found that this is a complex topic. It's one that's evolving real time as technology develops, and it's one where a variety of human rights organizations are putting out increasingly sophisticated, increasingly thoughtful reports and resources. So I would really emphasize digging deeper into those if this is a topic of interest.
Great, thanks so much, Dunstan. And on the next slide, we do have a survey that we're asking all participants to fill out, just to provide us with a little bit of feedback about this webinar, and as well as any of the previous ones which you may have attended. And we'd also encourage you to join tomorrow's webinar at the same time, which will be our 7th and final training on using the human rights and business toolkit that we've developed and is on the Business Call to Actions website. But I think unless there's anything further from you, Yvonne, this might be a good time to close.
No, thank you very much, Michaela.
Great. Thanks all for joining. And feel free to reach out to myself or Dunstan. Our website, our emails are on the BSR website if you have any additional questions. Excellent. Thanks all. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.